Professor Sanders is alive, Nadine said. He was actually the one who figured out how to break free of Richard's influence. He noticed something was wrong before the rest of us did. If he hadn't. And Amanda? Kate asked, trying to bring Nadine's attention back from whatever dark thoughts had gripped her. She made it too, Nadine said. She's alive. Still pretty shaken up after everything that happened, but she's alive. That's good. Kate nodded, letting out a slow breath. Amanda's tough. She'll come around with time. Nadine gave him a faint, sad look. She has a kid and a husband to reconnect with after this tutorial ends, Kate said. Hopefully that gives her enough of a reason to keep moving forward. The words felt heavier than he expected. They reminded him of his own family. His sisters and father were out there somewhere, hopefully surviving whatever version of this nightmare they had been thrown into. He pushed the thought aside. What about the others? Nadine drew in a slow breath. Brian was badly hurt, but he'll recover. His class gives him ways to heal from damage. It's slow, but it is enough that Amanda doesn't have to spend her mana keeping him alive. Cade nodded. Brian was a tank after all, he should be hard to kill. Kyle is worse off, Nadine continued. A lot worse. Without Amanda's healing, I'm sure he would have died already. Even with it. She didn't finish and Cade didn't need her to. Sage cleared his throat, drawing Cade's attention. Kranti is fine as well. Cade turned to him and Sage kept his gaze fixed just to the side of Cade's face, as if he was still refusing to make eye contact. He and Brian wanted to go back for more people. I had to cut off the tunnel behind us to stop them. His jaw tightened as he said it. Whether from guilt, anger, or shame, Cade couldn't tell. Earl's usual grin had faded. Any other survivors? The question came out quieter than Cade expected from him. Sage's mouth pressed into a thin line. A few. We got some people into the tunnels before Richard's shadows overran the camp. He hesitated. 11 total survived. Out of around 150. Damn. Cade looked past them toward the remains of camp persistence. Less than 10% survived. Nearly a whole camp of humans was wiped out in a single bloody night by one man. Good thing I didn't take any pity on Richard. That kind of monster deserved much worse than what I did to him. Well, Cade said after a moment, what's your plan? Nadine shook her head and returned to the conversation. Our plan? Yeah. You could stay hidden in the bunker or whatever you've built underground until the tutorial ends. It might even be safe for a while. But I wouldn't recommend it. Sage's mouth opened as if to say something but Cade kept going before he could interrupt. This is still a tutorial. I know that sounds harsh after what happened, but sitting underground for the next 2 months won't help you. The walls to the other quadrants are coming down soon. The monsters aren't going to get any easier. The system doesn't care that you're grieving. Nadine's face tightened and Cade softened his tone. I'm not saying everyone needs to run out and start fighting today. But at some point, you need to move forward. You need to become stronger. Sage shifted and his hands fidgeted. About that. Cade looked at him. The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. His hands flexed at his sides, and for once, Sage looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Cade could tell he was uncomfortable with whatever he was trying to say. Nadine glanced at him and seemed to realize he wasn't going to get the words out. Would you, maybe, consider joining the group again? She asked. Cade went still. Nadine's voice quickened. With someone like you, someone as strong as you are now, the others wouldn't have to fight. Not with you protecting them. We could get through the tutorial without losing anyone else. Cade stared at her for a long moment. He knew why Nadine was asking, but that did not stop the first ugly reaction from rising in his chest. Now they wanted him back. Now that he was strong. Now that he had killed a lord of the swamp in front of them. When he had been weak, he had been dead weight. Someone to pity or flat out ignore. Nadine had never treated him badly. She had been kind enough, but in those early days of the tutorial, she had not exactly fought to keep him close either. None of them had. He had been the coreless guy slowing everyone down, and everyone had known it. Cade glanced at Sage. The man looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole, which, given his magic and class, was actually possible. He let out a slow breath and forced the first response down. Laughing in their faces would not help anyone. Neither would snapping at them or just denying them outright. They had just survived a massacre. They were scared, exhausted, and looking for something solid to hold onto. They were drowning and looking for anything they could grab to stay afloat. The problem was that a drowning person could easily drag their rescuer down with them. Cade didn't want to be dragged down, but at the same time he couldn't just leave them here. Not like this. Go get the others, Cade said. Nadine blinked. What? The survivors. Everyone in the bunker, tunnel, whatever you're calling it. Cade looked from her to Seish. Bring them here, and I'll give you my answer. Seish's brow furrowed. Why? Because I said so. Do you really think arguing with me is going to do anyone any good? Nadine hesitated, then nodded. Oh, okay. She turned away first, but Seish lingered for half a second before whatever he saw on Cade's face made him think better of it. He followed after Nadine, and the two of them headed back toward the tree line. Cade waited until they were well out of earshot. Earl looked at him sidelong. You're not actually thinking about staying and playing bodyguard for them, are you? Hell no, Cade said. Earl's eyebrows rose. That was quick. Cade shook his head. I'm not staying here for 2 months protecting people while they hide and pretend the world hasn't completely changed. I have bigger plans for this tutorial. But you're not just leaving either, Earl said. No, Cade looked toward the ruined camp. They need to see what's possible. After what Richard did, they're scared. Probably broken in more ways than they even realize. If they stay hidden down there, they'll keep falling behind until some creature inevitably comes across them. Earl was quiet for a moment, so Cade continued. They need hope. They need to know that they can grow stronger on their own. They need to be reminded that even with what happened to them, they can still move forward. Earl rubbed a hand over his bald head. That's surprisingly motivational for a guy who just had his dick out a few minutes ago. Thanks, Cade chuckled. Could use some Polish though, Earl said. Your speech, not your. Cade cut him off. I get what you meant. While Nadine and Seish were gone, Cade turned his attention back to Carvaxis. One of its massive cannon claws had nearly broken off during the fight. With the obsidian flake and a little help from Earl, Cade finished separating it from the rest of the limb. Then he and Earl dragged the enormous claw away from the ruined camp and back to where they had spoken with Seish and Nadine. Earl looked from the claw to Cade, then back to the rest of Carvaxis' massive corpse. Not that I'm against hauling giant crab parts around, but why'd we drag this one away? The survivors are probably going to need something to eat, Cade said. And crab is usually pretty good. Earl jerked his chin toward the rest of Carvaxis. What about the rest of the big bastard? I have plans for that. Just leave it, Cade said as a small grin crept onto his face. A few minutes later, the ground near the tree line shifted. Cade watched as mud and stone pulled back and formed a sloped stairway that descended into darkness below. At least Seish has gotten better at using his earth magic. A moment later, people began climbing out. Nadine came first, followed by Seish and Professor Sanders. The older man looked exhausted and his clothes were streaked with mud. Amanda emerged behind him, pale and hollow-eyed, one hand pressed to her chest. Brian came after her, leaning heavily against Kranti. One side of his body was wrapped in crude bandages, and every step looked painful, but at least he was upright, unlike Kyle. Two men Cade did not recognize carried Kyle on a makeshift stretcher. His face was pale and his eyes sunken. Even from this distance Cade could clearly see that one of his legs was gone below the thigh, the remaining stump wrapped in layers of mud-stained cloth. The rest followed in a loose cluster. Mud covered all of them. Their faces were drawn and sullen, eyes puffy from crying or lack of sleep. Some moved like they were afraid the shadows would jump out and attack them. Others stared straight ahead with that empty, distant look of shock. Then Earl made a sound beside him. Crystal. A young woman near the back looked up. She was petite, probably early 20s, with mousy brown hair plastered against her face by mud and sweat. Her eyes widened. Earl crossed the distance in a few long strides and wrapped her in a bear hug that lifted her cleanly off her feet. Damn, he said, his voice rougher than before. It's good to see you made it out. Crystal clung to him for a moment, her face pressing against his shoulder. Cade looked away, giving them what little privacy he could in the middle of the open clearing. When the hug ended, Earl turned back toward Cade and cleared his throat. Cade looked back and that was when he realized everyone was staring at him. Well, fuck. He probably should have expected this. He had never been great at public speaking. He wasn't terrible, but not great either. Kaylee had always been better at that kind of thing. She could walk into a room, flash a smile, and somehow have everyone listening before she even said a word. Cade did not have that same sort of charismatic magnetism. Great, well here goes nothing. Nadine watched Cade face the survivors, and for a moment, she could not make the two versions of him fit together in her mind. She had known Cade before all of this. Before the tutorial and monsters and classes. He had been the tired postdoc who shuffled through the lab with dark circles under his eyes and dry comments under his breath. He was easy to overlook if someone wasn't paying attention. But the man standing in front of them now was not easy to overlook. Nadine forced herself to hold his gaze for more than a heartbeat. For the first time since walking out from underground, she looked directly at him without letting her eyes dart away. Gone was the Cade she remembered, and she could not stop wondering how he had grown so strong in only a month. They stood far from the ruined camp. Everyone was gathered in front of Cade now, just as he had asked. Was he going to stay? She hoped he would. With Cade here, they would not have to worry about the swamp monsters. They would not have to fear another person turning against them. They might not even have to fear the Viscount of the swamp, wherever that monster was hiding. Cade had taken down Carvaxis like it was nothing. She had no doubt that he could also beat the Viscount in a fight. If he stayed, they could breathe again. Cade looked over the group, and when he began speaking, Nadine gave him her full attention. There are a few things I want to say, he said, voice steady and calm. First, I'm sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what all of you went through in that camp. What Richard did was horrific. Several people flinched at the name, but Cade did not look away from them. There are enough monsters in this swamp without humans turning on each other. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. No one should. He paused, letting the words settle. I'm sure Sage and Nadine already told you, but I want you to hear it from me too. You don't have to fear Richard coming back. I made sure he can't hurt anyone else. Nadine glanced around. Every survivor stared at Cade with rapt attention. Even Kyle's eyes were open, fixed on him from the stretcher. Amanda had one hand pressed over her mouth. Professor Sanders looked stunned at the words. Cade continued. I know it's hard, but this tutorial isn't over. It's only been a month and you still have 2 more to get through. The walls are going to come down soon and I don't know what that'll bring. None of us do. The air itself felt heavier as he spoke, as if his words carried weight. But danger isn't the only thing out there, Cade said. There's opportunity too. The opportunity to grow stronger. To find yourself. To find your path. To build something new for yourselves and the people still standing beside you. Nadine felt something tighten in her chest. This is just the tutorial, Cade said. The beginning of whatever the system has planned for humanity. I'm not saying you need to rush out right now and start fighting creatures in the swamp. Some of you are hurt. Some of you are in shock. I understand that. Richard betrayed your trust and destroyed what safety you thought you had. His gaze moved over them, steady and calm. But eventually, you'll have to go back out there. You'll have to keep moving forward. And in the meantime, he paused. I might be able to help. Nadine's breath caught. He was going to stay. Maybe not forever, but for a while. Long enough to help them recover. Long enough to make them safe. Hope blossomed within her for the first time in what felt like weeks. Then Cade turned and looked toward the ruined camp. This is going to be a hard question, he said. Is there anything in the camp that any of you want to go back for? Any sentimental items? Anything you want to keep? Nadine followed his gaze and felt her stomach twist. Even from here, she could smell the bodies beginning to rot beneath the heat of the swamp. Mud, blood, broken wood, and death all mixed together into something she wanted to forget. A few survivors shook their heads. Someone whispered, "No." Amanda closed her eyes and turned her face away as a tear rolled down her cheek. None of them wanted to go back through that. None of them wanted to dig through the remains of Camp Persistence and relieve what they had seen there. Cade nodded slowly, as though confirming something to himself. All right then, he said. I need everyone to stay here. I'll be right back. Then he looked directly at Earl. Make sure no one gets close to the ruins. I don't want anyone getting caught up in what I'm about to do. Nadine stared after him. What was he about to do? No one moved and Cade did not explain. He turned away from the group and walked toward the ruined camp, his white cloak trailing behind him in the faint breeze. It moved strangely up close, not quite the way fabric should. From where Nadine stood, she swore she saw a piece of the hem detach and drift away like a loose flake before vanishing into nothing. She blinked and the cloak looked whole again. Cade continued forward, passing broken beams, splintered shelters, and the churned mud where people had died less than a day ago. When he reached the center of the ruins, he stopped. For a long moment, he stood still and looked around at the destruction surrounding him. Nadine could not see his face, but she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a slow breath. Then his cloak unraveled. Pearlescent white particles erupted from the fabric, expanding around him in a shimmering cloud. The motes caught the midday sun as they spun, each one flashing with hints of ivory, silver, and soft rainbow hues. It was beautiful. Then the cloud expanded as beauty became violence. The pearlescent white surged outward from Cade in a brutal wave, swallowing the ruins of Camp Persistence in seconds. The air screamed as particles tore through the clearing in a hurricane of white, moving so quickly they blurred into a solid wall. Wind slammed against Nadine's face. Several survivors stumbled back. Amanda let out a small, frightened sound. Brian shifted in front of Kyle's stretcher on instinct, as if his battered body could shield Kyle from whatever Cade had unleashed. Nadine's awe curdled into fear. The storm did not look like any magic she had seen before. It raged through broken shelters, broke down the bodies, and churned through the mud and blood and rot as it devoured the destroyed camp piece by piece. Even Carvax's corpse was dismantled as the storm passed over. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm slowed. The screaming wind faded. The motes lost their fury and began to drift, soft and silent, falling through the air like pearlescent snow. Nadine's fear loosened as wonder crept back in. The motes glimmered as they descended, gentle now, almost peaceful. The camp was gone. Completely and utterly erased from where it had once stood. Every piece of wood had vanished. Every body, every strip of torn cloth, every smear of blood, every piece of organic matter left behind by Richard's massacre. The ground was still churned and scarred, but the horror that had covered it was simply no longer there. Nadine's breath caught and she took a step forward without thinking. A hand settled on her shoulder. She looked back and found Earl shaking his head. "He told us to stay back," Earl said quietly. "I don't know if he's done just yet, but I'd wait for him to give the all-clear." Nadine nodded and Earl removed his hand. She forced herself to stay where she was. But what else could Cade possibly do? He had erased the camp. He had taken away the bodies, the blood, the rot, the evidence of everything they had failed to stop. Surely that was all he had intended. Then the ground trembled beneath her feet. Nadine looked sharply to the side. Sage had gone very still. His eyes were narrowed, his face pinched in confusion. A heartbeat later, that confusion turned into disbelief. Nadine looked back at Cade. His hands were raised toward the sky as white slowly fell around him. A second later thick wooden limbs pushed upward from the ground, twisting and joining together as if guided by invisible hands. Walls formed as living wood rose into rounded structures. Branches bent overhead and fused into roofs. Openings shaped themselves into doorways. Within moments, half a dozen huts stood where the ruins had been, each large enough to fit at least 4 people comfortably inside. Nadine's mouth parted. Then more roots erupted around the huts. These grew outward, forming a wide perimeter. Trunks rose shoulder to shoulder and braided together into a living wall. Sharpened spikes pushed from the outer side, long and dark and wickedly pointed. Even from a distance, Nadine felt a faint shiver crawl up her spine. The spikes looked sharp enough to pierce her just for staring at them too long. Finally, the growth stopped and Cade lowered his arms. No one spoke as they watched him walk back as if he had done nothing more strenuous than cross the clearing. There was no strain on his face or stagger in his steps. Every time Sage used his mana, effort showed in him. His jaw tightened or his shoulders tensed. When he really pushed himself, sweat gathered on his brow. Every time she used exploit opening, it pulled at her stamina and left a bite of strain in her muscles. Cade had erased a massacre and grown a fortified camp without so much as a hitch in his breath. When he reached them, everyone stared at him in complete disbelief. Cade looked over the survivors, his expression calm. "I know loss is hard," he said. "And I know moving forward will be harder. But the ash of what was brings new life. New chances. New opportunities for growth.